the nation state that you think might be attacking you might not really be the one that is.
So John, we've long talked about the fact that attribution is super hard when it comes to APT groups or attackers of any kind. And it sounds like we've got a story here that kind of shows exactly why it can be so hard.
Right. Yeah, actually, this is an interesting article, I guess. The NCSC, which is National Cybersecurity Center, which is part of GCHQ, that's the UK's kind of version of the NSA, I guess. And the NSA, the United States organizations, they kind of jointly released a report about the Turla group. And the Turla group has been attributed to some Russian nation-state actors. And the interesting thing is, and we've talked about this before, it's really easy, in my opinion, for any nation-state actor to kind of pretend to be another nation-state actor, as long as they really know pretty well the tool sets they use and their techniques. Especially if you've been in incident response, you can really kind of, we've seen this, where you can kind of get a really quick assessment of, well, this looks like it's Chinese, or this looks like it's Iranian, or it looks like Russian based on the tool sets being used.
Yep.
So the interesting thing about this is that apparently the Turla group, they were targeting some Middle East targets, which also the Iranians target Middle East targets. And there was some use of by the Turla group of reusing infrastructure and tool sets that the Iranian groups use. Also, they did a lot of interesting things along the way. So they had scripts running that would look for the back doors that the Iranians had already implanted on assets and then try to reuse those backdoor web shells that the Iranians used. And then also target the same victims. So there's a lot of victim overlap as well from what they reported. They were using the this active server pages web shell. So we've talked about web shells before. Web shell is basically a script that you can deploy on a web server, and it kind of gives you somewhat of a command line file manager-esque like backdoor into those servers. So they use that, which are typically, the Neuron and Nautilus implants are very Turla-esque. They're ones that they use a lot. But some of the other things are not that they use. They also use the Iranian C2 infrastructure, which I thought was interesting. So the Iranian nation-state actors, they use a control panel called Poison Frog. And the Turla actors, Russian, use the Poison Frog control panels to distribute their payloads to victims that were already in those panels, already compromised by those things. So it's an interesting kind of overlap, and it makes the waters really muddied in terms of being able to tell who's who, especially when both nations are targeting very similar victim sets, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, the part that makes it even more wild for me is that Turla is up in Iranians' business, and we've got a report about it from GCHQ and the NSA. So they're probably up in both of their business.
Right.
They've all got views into each other's infrastructure and what's going on.
Right.
Which is a little bit nuts. But it is also interesting because typically when we talk about the attribution problem, we're saying someone could easily pretend to be another actor. Here they're actually using the other person's infrastructure and tooling, like in deployment. It's not like they made a copy of it and they put it on a separate server and they're pretending to be Iran.
Using the exact same infrastructure,
Yeah.
same machines that are already being used by the Iranians for their, objectives, and they piggybacked on them to do the same type of
That's
stuff.
wild. Yeah.
I guess it also lets you know that the Iranian nation-state actors aren't doing a lot of good OPSEC in terms of protecting their infrastructure.
Yeah, or monitoring, apparently.
Right.
Because if somebody else is in your own system, using your infrastructure for attacks, and you haven't noticed it, if you are an offensive hacking group for a government, you're doing legitimate work like this, like you've got something to do, you need to keep an eye on your own infrastructure. It's not just a matter of offensive attacks against somebody else. It's a matter of defending what you've got, because you've got hacker tools sitting on a server somewhere.
Right.
And if anything happens that could be attributed back to what you're doing, it's going to be very hard to convince somebody else that, oh no, it wasn't us hacking them this time with our tools and our IP address and all this other stuff that ties back to us.
Right.
Right. It falls down to a political blame game that somebody could, pivot on a different, government's infrastructure, do a bunch of nasty stuff, and be like, it wasn't us, it was them. And that's really hard to prove, especially when it's like, doing some nefarious behavior, and then all of a sudden they're pointing to somebody else. It could just be a nightmare for those particular countries that are using that infrastructure.
It does make you, let's say you were a victim of this, kind of come into question of, well, who was it that was here? Because by my incident response, investigation, it looked like Iran, but now it could have been Russia, and maybe they're after different types of information along the way. So you might have to reassess what the objectives might have been in terms of penetrating whatever that target was, whoever the victims were.
You kind of have to ask, what do you actually really know anymore?
Right. It's very hard to do good attribution or foolproof attribution of who actually just attacked you. Don't always jump to conclusions about who is targeting you.
The takeaway here is that attribution is a much harder game as a result of this. I mean, it may be very infrequent to see a group co-opt somebody else's resources like this for an attack, but the possibility will always be there in the back of our minds now. It happened once, it could be happening again, and so you're never quite clear on who's really doing the attack.